Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today's a roundtable with some people who are pretty easy to get along with. Our topic is mastering difficult conversations, and this is the third part of the series in which we discuss how we better manage other people. Our emotionally intelligent participants have watched this podcast, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life, or wherever you stream your podcasts. But I'll do a quick summary now before we go into our Q&A. Part 3 of the Mastering Difficult Conversations series focuses on how we manage other people's psychological states. Topics discussed include how our confidence in our own conversational ability reduces our avoidance of difficult conversations. And then how we help others to reframe, refocus and redirect their thinking, and how other people's needs for safety and protection are legitimate, and how validating this and helping them feel safe also helps them shift to higher needs such as partnering and co-experimenting with us. So to help others feel safe, you should explicitly create a safe space for them. You should speak with transparency as open, candid and caring conversations send them messages of trust. The most important skill is not talking, but listening, and then building rapport. And if our intention is clear that we really want to connect, that intention will inform our body language and naturally positively impact the other person's body. In the podcast, an excellent way to put these strategies into action is the oars techniques, which is described briefly. And finally, there are 3 types of difficult conversations that we look at. The what happened conversation, conversations that evoke intense emotions and feelings, and conversations that challenge one's identity. And specific strategies to deal with each of them are put forward. In conclusion, mastering difficult conversations means being able to step back, to rise above the conversation and analyse what the dynamics are, seeing what implicit needs are being expressed, and then actively taking care of those needs in the other person. All right, so and now to our roundtable or Q&A with the very fine people who I suggested. Are definitely not difficult. Well, we'll see. As usual, I'll see who wants to jump in first, but I'd be very interested in, your thoughts and insights and questions, perhaps even difficult questions that you have about this third part of the Difficult Conversation series. Who would like to kick off?
I can go.
As we would say in Australia, you're a good sport.
I'm a good sport.
Yeah.
This podcast really landed with me because it truly aligns with so many of our efforts that we're doing within our organization in creating a culture of feedback. And so we use the term of feedback for redirection when addressing when thinking about addressing difficult conversations.
Yes.
And kind of related to behavior, like addressing a behavior and how to redirect to the more favorable behavior. But the whole concept of the reframing and that co-creating of solutions, what we've found with our managers is when you create that safe space and you approach these conversations more from the seat of a coach. I'm like, how are we going to co-create a solution here? Here's the problem. How do we, so we're both on board. We're both contributing to what the solution is. It's just been amazing how that shift in a mindset for managers has, not that having difficult conversations is ever going to be easier, but it just gives a framework where it makes it more approachable, it's not as difficult to have the difficult conversation.
Fantastic. There's a lot of stepping off points here, Karen. I hope I can remember them, but that's fantastic. So let's start with this redirection is like the that's an achievement in a difficult conversation. If one can get to the point of redirecting people, that's when you're starting to talk about doing different things. But to get there, as you suggested, there's a reframing of the purpose of this conversation, right? And implicitly, very often, if you're giving constructive feedback, this is what I'm assuming we're talking about, right? Or as the older people on this call may remember it as negative feedback. It's giving feedback that might be uncomfortable, that people may not want to hear. Very often that's held as a criticism, it's held as a personal judgment, it's held as an attack. And so naturally, people's needs to protect are activated. And that need to self-protect, it may be evidenced in passive behaviour or aggressive behaviour, but it's still a very legitimate need because the person is feeling under attack, right? So the first thing that has to be done is we reframe the question from one of attack to one of mutual support and learning. Then you can refocus the person's attention on different things. So, when a person's in that complete defense mode, what are they looking at? They're looking for any signs in which you're criticizing, looking for any signs that you might be angry. They're looking in the wrong places for something constructive, right? And they may not even hear the constructive things you're saying, right? And then you can get to the redirection of eventually, you want to get people to be thinking new thoughts, doing different things, right? So that's one whole part of what you said. There's another part there that I was really interested in, and perhaps you can elaborate a bit. What I'm interested in is whether this whole approach has given your managers more confidence with respect to these conversations. You said, of course, they're not easy, they're still difficult. Did I hear something towards the end where you talked about that?
Yeah, so that where a difficult conversation, like you were talking about, where someone can get defensive when it comes in as like a disciplinary action, like I'm telling you what you did wrong and I want you to do it this way. The reframing with our managers is approaching it from is it refocusing on how do you go into this conversation collaboratively to create more of a team in creating the solution than that drill sergeant sort of like, you're going to do it my way. And I've just found it's in having coaching the coach kind of conversations with managers where you can see just that shift in mindset where they're, oh, wait a second, it's not me being, the bad guy or delivering this difficult information. How can we make this situation better together? And that's been really, really kind of enlightening and fascinating to see.
That is again, there's a lot of little stepping off points there, but you can see the reframe, refocus, redirect taking place there with your managers.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're having a different sense of what the purpose of this conversation is. It's giving them different things to focus on, and I would suggest looking very closely at the other person's needs, that are manifest in the conversation, and then redirecting, the way they go about this, right? One of the things, of course, and this is the third of the series. So the first talked about conflict, what it is, and then difficult conversations. The second talked about self-management, right? And so, and of course, this is where we bring it all together. But you can't manage those difficult feedback conversations if you haven't first managed self. This is like the basis of emotional intelligence. First, you have to be aware of self, and then manage self. Then you can perhaps be aware of others, and therefore be a better chance of skillfully managing them, right? So, I think that's what's probably going on for the managers there. They're first off, they're settling themselves because uh, there's a different purpose here, and they feel like they've got some skills to meet that purpose. So their own anxiety drops, and now they can perhaps have a chance of actually seeing the other person and responding live. That's a wonderful initiative, Karen. It's and yeah, we could talk more about that, but I am cognizant that there are three other people here, and I don't want to make them impatient or feel like, they're being left out, because we could end up having a difficult conversation. Who might be next?
The difficult.
Is that you, Terry?
Oh, always. Because as I'm in full control and I have a grip on my emotions, I can say these things quite easily. The thing that I found the most profound was to ask questions where we don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And normally in difficult conversations, I go into it very well prepared in the sense that I have those answers. Where when I'm more around the table, I don't have prepared answers and I'm asking questions of stuff that I have no idea about. But when I go into difficult conversations, in getting control of my emotions, I've also prepped the answers to my questions. So I just found that to be a really interesting counterpoint to how I maybe have to change the way that I do things.
Maybe. I mean, I would still prepare assiduously in the way that you do. I mean, I think that's very, very important. So I wouldn't suggest changing that at all.
Then why did you mention that?
Well, there's something disarming and something relaxing about a person who is genuinely curious about us. So you might remember we mentioned three types of difficult conversation. There's the what happened conversation. So a lot of conversations are like we can't even agree what we're talking about, and those difficult conversations devolve to who's right and who's wrong. Right. So if we come into that conversation, for example, knowing the answers, it's just going to lock us into an adversarial who's right and who's wrong. Right. If the person is in very intense emotions, they're experiencing very powerful emotions, a spirit of inquiry with them may help. Where you're showing where you're definitely interested, but you might be asking, why is this? I can see you're upset. Why is it so upsetting? Is there something we can do? Again, it's not coming in direct with answers. You may have some good answers in the back of your mind that you can introduce later, right? And I think you should. So in the third type of difficult conversation, which is the one around identity, when a person feels like their identity is being challenged, we can't presume to know what their identity is. And people are very sensitive to being told who they are, right? Or what type of person they are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's lots of reasons why asking questions to which you don't know the answer is important. As a general answer, when we're in a difficult conversation and we display that kind of, sorry about the jargon here, epistemic humility, i.e. that we don't know everything, that again is a de-escalation procedure. It helps people feel like there's not a power relations going on here where I know and you don't, right? So there's a lot of good reasons, but as I said, I would not be suggesting that you don't prepare and have good ideas to hand and have a view about what might be the preferred outcome.
Yeah, I don't know anybody that doesn't silently rehearse the situation in their head over and over before you have the conversation.
Yeah.
That's part of you getting control of your emotions.
Correct. Yeah, because we want to feel like we've got some control. That's the key word there. And if we feel like we've got some sort of ideas and way of navigating the conversation, our own anxiety is going to decrease, and we'll feel like we know how to. But also, you want to have the facts at hand in case the facts are disputed, right? So yeah, by all means, we should do that. But it might be a phase in the conversation as well that we're talking about here. Like there's a technique that is discussed in this podcast called the oars technique, where you ask open questions, so questions to which you don't know the answer. Whatever they say, you affirm it. Now, affirming is not necessarily agreeing with, it's just acknowledging that that's their view or their feeling or their perception or their experience. And then you prompt their talking and their exploration using reflections. It might be literal reflections or paraphrases. This demonstrates your interest in them and that you are listening. And then you might summarize it. Now, the oars is a very, very powerful technique for creating rapport, but it's not the entirety of a conversation. So again, this asking of questions to which you don't know the answer is probably a stage, it's a phase in the establishing of the rapport. And you've still got in your back pocket, or in the back of your head, all those things you prepared and the ideas in that capacious head of yours, Terry. So I think that it's also that it may not be the entirety of the conversation, but very often people come into these conversations, managers, for example, or in personal life, and we come in on the attack. We've got the right ideas. You've done wrong. Here's the correct view. And obviously, that generally speaking does not work well. Yeah. Okay. That leaves two other very fine people, two other very non-difficult people. Who would like to sort of jump in here?
I can jump in.
Thank you.
I thought my initial thought was that we need another 4 more podcasts on this topic. Because I felt like it really resonated with people that maybe you don't know really well in a work environment or you don't have a personal relationship with. But I think that it's harder when you know the person and you're having a difficult conversation when you really know them, and whether or not it's work or personal. But it's always very surprising to me how really listening, how important that is, and how that fuels a lot of difficult conversations, and how people aren't able to see the other person's view or aren't willing to.
Oh, this is so good, Colin. This is a big question. And I really am glad you asked it, and it has made me think maybe I should talk about this in another podcast. I'm sure this is everyone's experience, that we might be really, for example, we could have learned how to be really skilled at difficult conversations at work, but we go back to kindergarten when we go back to our primary relationships, right? And before I dive in, I'd be actually curious about what everyone on this call thinks. Why do you think these are more difficult? What makes them more difficult, do you think?
Emotions. Anything that's personal is clouded with emotions.
Uh-huh. I agree with that. And
the silliness of emotions.
I think the personal stakes are higher though too.
Yeah. That's why I think the emotions are stronger. Yeah.
I was just going to say, taking it personally, the 4 agreements and taking it personally is, I think, where we get stuck often, and that's where our defensiveness comes from.
Yeah. And I think the taking it personally is a part of this idea that the stakes are higher. So let's just explore that for a little bit. What does it mean when we say the stakes are higher? I mean, it might be obvious, but it's probably worth spelling it out. How come?
What I was sort of thinking is that, like, the end of the day in a work conversation, if the person on the other end of that conversation doesn't like you afterwards, it's a it's a work relationship. But if it's somebody that is much more personally connected and important, you kind of need to have harmony as an outcome in order to progress.
Yeah, because you're cohabiting, for example.
Or
even
or if it's a kid, or if it's a parent, or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or like sibling, or your, your mate, your significant other.
Yeah.
In all of those cases, there is that desire for and a need for harmony coming out of the conversation.
Yeah, because you're going to have recurrent interactions with them. And so because of that, because of what Chris has identified there, what do we tend to do?
Not have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Avoid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Avoid elephants, run.
Yeah, exactly. The elephant in the lounge room sort of thing, right? Yeah, so it is interesting, isn't it, when the stakes are higher in this way, which they definitely are, because we've invested a lot more in these relationships and the implications are greater. So the fear of it going well is much greater. And so this is like a kind of almost universal form of avoidance or procrastination around these issues, and it can go for years, right? What happens when these conversations are avoided for years?
Resentment.
Time
What is
bomb.
that? Time bombs, yeah.
Yeah, resentment. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens is, in my experience, I mean my experience, is both parties, whether it's our parents or our kids or a significant other, we keep a ledger book on each other, and then what we do is the bomb is that it builds up to a point where we feel like that's it. They've really transgressed this time. I've had enough. I've got enough evidence now. I'm going to give them anyway. So it's like a Spanish galleon, and when we give them a broadside, we've all the evidence is loaded up, and we're sure we're going to win. So this is probably a version. These personal difficult conversations are probably a combination of those three types of, what happened. We can't even agree on that. I did take the garbage bin out. It was you who left the toilet seat, up, or, whatever. There's usually very intense emotions, and there's real identity issues at stake. And so the logic appears to be, if we're going to have this conversation, I'm going to gather all this evidence so that I'll win this conversation, and I'll keep my sense of self intact. But I think what sits underneath that, Colleen, is a lack of confidence in our ability, a bit like Karen was talking about with the managers, so it's just a lack of confidence that I can navigate this type of conversation successfully. And, and there's fear, of course, there's fear of the intense emotions in ourselves particularly, or it might be with the other. So I guess this is where this podcast, as you're suggesting, could be elaborated to say, well, how do we apply this into our most important relationships, the ones where we've got the most at stake? I think the strategies are the same, but it's probably going to be more nuanced. Part of the answer would be to not let things build up. It could be too late, all right? They've already built up, but here we go again. That is amazing. So it should follow me, right? And then, oh God, my software is really playing up. I've turned the gimbal off apparently, but it keeps turning itself back on. I'll have to look up why it's doing this. Anyway, I think I'll just get back. I'll stop using my hands so much, and it probably will stop, right? Yeah. So I think if we stop, if we don't build up these resentments, the implications of the conversation aren't going to be so great.
Mhm.
And I remember, I don't know whether I've told you guys this story. When Mary and I got married, the priest was a family friend. So, and we were up in front of everyone, the congregation. And before he did the marriage vows, he said to us, "Now, Chris and Mary, I'd like you to make a promise to each other. Are you okay with that?" And I mean, what are you meant to say? You're up there in front of the congregation. No. Tell us what the promise is first. It wouldn't be a good look. So, of course, we said yes. And the promise we had to make was that when you fight it, you'll be the first to apologise. And of course, you can't both be first to apologise. So there's a kind of logical sense. We agreed to that, right? And I thought about it a lot over the years. And I realised what he was getting at, that generally speaking, when we argue in intimate relations, what we're arguing about is trivial. A lot of it is small stuff, resentments and so on. And the argument is doing damage to the relationship, and that's far more important than the so-called cause of the dispute. So we're apologising not so much about who's right and who's wrong. We're apologising for doing damage to our relationship. And I think that kind of attitude to it, that whatever we're disagreeing about, wherever there's tension about, the far more important thing is protecting our bond. So that's a kind of reframe, I guess, thinking about it in the way that we've been saying, and it redirects our attention. We focus on different things then. But that's such a great question, Colin. I think I will come back to that, because I've had the same thought. I've noticed that I can do stuff in my professional life that I'm really not that good at in my own personal life. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. Very, very interesting. So I think that's all of you, isn't it? Is that right? Have we? No? Oh, I've missed Chris. Oh, because Chris spoke, but yeah. So, Chris, what's lurking in the, speaking of capacious minds?
I was thinking a lot about that trust building component that you're referring to, and the value that ORS method can have in that. But I was also thinking that sometimes I'm back to let's call it a professional difficult conversation. So a workplace difficult conversation that you're trying to have, where if you're a manager having a difficult conversation with somebody on your team, and what you're trying to get them to trust is partly, or what they're maybe apprehensive about, is they don't want necessarily what they're going to say to you to be potentially used or have repercussions in the future, right? Like the way you get an open conversation and get an honest output from them, while also reserving the right that sometimes that commentary might have downstream repercussions. And so you can build trust by lying to them and saying that it won't, but obviously that's not particularly high in integrity. And there is also, of course, there is that desire, even with a workplace relationship, that person, you come out of that with that person still liking you at the end. Do you know what I mean? So, some thoughts on how we can build trust when we can't necessarily guarantee that outcome is going to be positive for the person on the other side of the conversation.
Boy, almost regret asking you that,
It always happens with Chris.
No, but it's fantastic. Really great. It's really difficult, and I'll come at this a little sideways. I think I was thinking, this can become particularly difficult in larger and larger organisations, right? Where it can be harder through all the echelons of management, to create a sort of unanimous allegiance to these kinds of values we're talking about here, in how to operate in culture and so on, right? And it's been my experience that the larger the organisation, you can get it then in niches, in teams, or in. So, I think a person needs to be prudent, right? Like I would say, I'm a pretty trusting person. And I'm clear in my mind that win-wins are a better way to operate in workplaces and life generally, and trusting, it should be my default, right? And there's a very famous, I don't know what you call it, concept in social psychology called the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know whether you've heard of this. Yeah, okay. So, but anyway, the idea is, is it going to pay off to cooperate or to betray? And the idea is that two people are arrested for something. They're interrogating them separately, and basically, if they put in their partner, they'll get a more lenient treatment. They might even get off scot-free. And the same offer's offered to the other person. And if they both just stay stum, say nothing, they get a pretty light sentence. But if you get put in by the other, you get a really steep sentence, right? And so they play around with this dynamic of whether the people will cooperate or whether they'll betray each other. And here's the thing, that they then created a competition. They got these computer programmers to create simulations of this game, this Prisoner's Dilemmas game, to find out what's the most optimal thing that humans should do. And the program that won it was called Tit for Tat. And Tit for Tat, it was the simplest, apparently it was a really short piece of code, and it was the simplest program, basically showed this, that the default should be to trust, to cooperate. So the first move should always be that, to try to elicit trust from the other partner. If you're betrayed, your next move should be to betray them. But then the next move should be to trust again. And basically what happens with the simulation is, the vast majority of the time then trust begets trust, right? But the first move should be trust. But basically, I think what they're saying is you shouldn't be a mug. You shouldn't be. So these kind of really pragmatic considerations are very important, right? We're not living in a perfect world where we're just going to naively, like you might be going into a difficult conversation with a sociopath. I would suggest we're probably not going to be doing what we're talking about in this podcast in that context, right? Because all of this depends on a sense of eliciting from a person, humility and a spirit of inquiry and honesty, and a desire to actually be safe and to connect, right? So there could be situations where the person's track record is so bad, right? You'd be crazy to trust them, right? They're not committed to the kind of thing we're talking about, right? So I guess this is a bit like Colleen's question. This is leading to further another podcast, isn't it? You know, when should we apply this? And I think it's like the tit for tat program. It should be our default almost all the time, except when it isn't. And you know, but to come back to more precisely to your observation, Chris, if you perceive, for example, this person may not be telling the whole truth because they're worried if they do, it's going to disadvantage them. That's the gist of it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are many occasions where you can actually make that explicit. You actually talk about it.
Yeah.
You know, you can say to the person, look, I know that you might be holding some stuff back here because you're worried about it disadvantaging you. So you're taking away all of that, and you say, and to be honest with you, it might, right? But generally speaking, that's not necessarily catastrophic. But you know, because you're actually trying to help the person adjust to reality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most workplace negative feedback, constructive feedback is the person's, you know, underperforming or they're transgressing some behavioural norms. You know, in other words, they're not adjusting to reality. And if they keep doing it, it's really going to disadvantage them. Like if it's not addressed, they're going to drift further and further away. They're going to lose more and more. Right? So that's the other part of having difficult conversations, very often for people, avoiding them, especially avoiding identifying the elephant in the room. In this case, the person's not actually telling me the truth because they're worried it'll disadvantage them. Ultimately, if we collude with them in that avoidance, it's not going to do them any favours.
Yeah.
Because they're going to drift further and further. You know, I come across this a lot in the work I do in law firms, in the big law firms, where often managers aren't giving feedback to underperforming junior lawyers, and it's kind of cruel, right? Because it ends up blowing up, right? And they're avoiding the conversation for all these human reasons we've been talking about. But it's actually all about themselves, not about the kid who's struggling, right? And they look at the other junior lawyers who aren't struggling and figure it out, and they think, well, they should be like them, right? And so why should I be bothering with people if we can get a continual resource of people who I don't have to coach and mentor, you know. But anyway, so there's lots of ways this question plays out, but it's a great question, and but I think most of the time we can be honest with people, and it's uncomfortable. But if you then help the person navigate the uncomfortableness and there's still a relationship there, there's an even deeper loyalty.
I think you have to, based on your whole comment, that if you don't, you're almost colluding with them. Right?
Yeah.
So like that's going to end badly, like probably amplified. So
Totally.
yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting quandary.
It is a very interesting one, and a bit like having kids, you know, and they're doing things that are dangerous but they're really enjoying it, and you decide, they'll be cranky if I take that away from them or stop them doing it, right? It's like, you wouldn't do that, right? Or you shouldn't. All right, guys. Look, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I look forward to when we get together the next time for our next Q&A or roundtable, as we're calling it. But again, I thank you for your insight and just for being who you are, really.